Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Humm. I'm one of the Dialogue Doctor coaches, and I have the great privilege of being here with Mary Van Everboeck today. Mary, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit about where you are as an author and what you're working on?
Sure. Well, I'm further than I was 2 years ago.
Congratulations. Further is always good.
And I guess what I've been doing is concentrating on writing short stories.
That is always a great place to start when you are kind of at the beginning of your writing journey. What's like the best thing that you've learned from your short stories?
Well, I think, and I don't know if that's primarily what I'll be doing or in conjunction with writing novels, but all my short stories have to have happy endings, and which I think is a rarity for
Yeah,
short stories.
love a
Um,
feel-good ending.
yeah, a feel good ending. And I'm hoping the reader takes away something that either makes them smile or gives them an idea that, oh, if it had happened to them, they did a pretty good job at getting through it.
I love that. I love that. I feel like that is like so indicative of you. I feel like you always bring so much light and levity to everything that you do that it makes sense that your short stories have that same kind of hope in them. So, we are doing an Ask Me Anything session today. So, the goal of these sessions is just for you to be able to talk through anything that you have questions about, either in your story, in your plot, in a character. We could even, if you had a scene that you wanted to read together, we could do that. But it's my understanding that you are getting ready to write a series.
I've been thinking. That's
Okay.
why when I saw Ask Me Anything, I jumped on it, even though I had to prep for it because I didn't know what I was going to talk about. So
That's okay. I have actually found that with authors, you don't need a lot of prep to talk about the stories that you have in your minds. You spend so much time with your stories and your characters that usually it just becomes a really natural conversation with anyone, maybe in the grocery store, maybe with a coach, maybe with an editor, maybe with a friend. So hopefully we can make that happen for you today. Do you want to share a little bit about kind of what you're thinking about with that series, or do you want to jump right into a question?
can I start with why I jumped at this opportunity?
Yeah, I'd love that.
Okay. So I never had planned on writing a series. Never dawned on me. And I really never thought of writing a thriller. But
Mhm.
before the Dash came into existence, before it was created, um, the nano period before that, when we all kind of shared our work on Slack, I wrote a story that had a backdrop of thriller. But I would consider it a lit fic with a backdrop of a thriller. And then what happened is last year, when the first time I did a dash, maybe it was the second time, but it was during a dash program period that after I wrote the story of Christine, the thriller, then it dawned on me, wait a minute, I want to write something that leads more to why I wrote the heroine's journey of the, it's going to be the second story, but it was the first one I had written, if
Mm,
that makes sense.
yep.
So I wrote the preceding story to the one I had written previously. It's all mixed
Hmm.
up. So I have a draft of the beginning, the first part of the series, which I'm still vacillating back and forth whether it's going to be single or multi vehicle character. And then I have what I wrote and really fell in love with, the um, first one I wrote that will become the second book in the series, which is her heroine's journey.
Hmm.
And then a funny thing happened. For whatever reason, I have no idea why. I got interested in reading, you may not be familiar with Greg Hurwitz. He writes thriller, Evan Smoke's Nowhere Man,
Mm,
Orphan X. He's a thriller writer. But I got interested in his writings, and I also got interested in the Reacher series by Child.
mm-hmm,
And my character, and this is where I have the dilemma. I seem to always gravitate. It's like impossible for me not to write lit fic.
okay.
That's my background. That's my profession, counselor, all that jazz.
Mm-hmm,
That's my substance, all that stuff. However, there was a period I really didn't want to write lit fic. I wanted to write genre, and that's
mm-hmm,
where the thriller came in. But I can't do it every time it goes into lit fic. So I decided I'll write lit fic with the context or the backdrop of a thriller
mm-hmm.
or something else. Okay. So my question, one of my questions to you is, I don't know if anybody writes thrillers within the context of lit fic. And if I take Reacher, who the reason his stories, Child's and Hurwitz's stories, really appeal to me as far as their vehicle character, Reacher and Evan Smoke, their character voices are so you they're not unique, but they're distinct,
Yes.
and they're nobody else has them,
Mm-hmm,
And while my vehicle character Christine is not the same
mm-hmm,
as Reacher or Smoke, there are aspects of her that she will become more like them because what happens to her. Her child's killed, her husband's killed.
mm-hmm,
It's a mess. Okay. It goes through a lot of stuff. So she can easily become, but I want her to be feminine. I want her to care. Not that those two other characters don't care, but they care in a masculine where I want my caring and a feminine, even though I don't want her to be, I want her to be similar to the male characters. I'm saying in that she will not commit to any relationships
mm-hmm.
because of the loss that she's gone through, but she still
Sure.
cares. All right.
Sure.
And, but she's going to have aspects of them, but different. So I guess I'm going around and around here, but um,
So it
I
sounds like,
don't know if I can write. I don't know if people will want to read thrillers that are or lit fic or thrillers that are lit fic or lit fic that are thrillers. And
so,
since you read so much,
so here's what I have found about, and this is just my personal opinion. If anyone is listening to this, please feel free to come at me for this. But I firmly believe that genre is created as a marketing strategy to help people connect to things that they enjoy reading, right? The reason that there are tropes in thriller, the reason there are tropes in romance, the reason that there are tropes in science fiction is because people gravitate to the things that they're comfortable with, right? You're expecting it. It's why we love serials on TV, right? Like, at um, if you're watching a Law and Order, at 25 after the hour, they've identified and they're getting ready to transition from the law part to the order part, right? Like 20 years or however long it was running. SVU, the same way. They've been running for 25 years. You can almost set your clock to where they are in the story. Yeah, they have some other ones. Supernatural. I don't know if you were a fan of that, but like
oh,
they were like spot on 25 minutes. They've identified who the monster is. 50 minutes after the hour, they've fought it and they have the last 5 minutes for brother time, right? Like it was, and it made us feel comfortable with what we're expecting, right? That's a wonderful thing if that's the kind of author that you gravitate to being. Where lit fic kind of pushes the boundaries is that it doesn't have to be any one thing. The structure of the genre doesn't really have to be there. And I think lots of times new authors get have these great stories, these great characters in their head, and they get so caught up with the marketing strategies of this is how you sell sci-fi the way that Lee Childs does. Lee Childs' Reacher books are fantastic, but they win the audience because they fell in love with Reacher and they just want to watch Reacher do what Reacher does book after book after book after book. So it is possible to create space for stories that don't fit and match exactly within a genre if your characters are compelling and they have a good storyline. Personally, I think compelling characters are more important than a compelling storyline. I would rather spend 5 hours reading a story that I really like the characters, but I don't really feel like it's going anywhere, than 5 hours reading a story that I understand every note and detail of the plot, but I don't like the characters. So,
Absolutely.
okay.
Absolutely. And go ahead.
Nope, go. You.
Well, and that leads me to my second. The second book, I feel not that I don't have to change a lot her character, but I have more of a sense of her character voice
Mhm.
than the second book I did, which is going to be the first one. And the reason I'm having trouble with the first one, her character voice is you don't get to really see her as her without being in pain,
Mm,
without suffering,
mhm.
without you don't see her the homeostasis, the I forget what Jeff calls it, the norm, the
The
um,
world before.
no, the way her normally her character voice would be.
Oh, like her
Um,
baseline voice.
her baseline, right? You don't
Okay.
get to see that the way I've written it because of all the tragedy that she has to go through in order to push her into the second book. Now, I probably can learn how to write that, right? That's
Mhm.
what I have to do. I have to, even within the midst of all her pain, I have to let the reader see her baseline. I was even thinking maybe I need to do a book before that, that showed her in FBI school, that showed her teaching,
Mm.
that showed her when she was growing up in the orphanage. I don't know, to give the reader a baseline. I'm not sure. Go ahead.
Nope, go ahead. Keep.
No, so that's where they're not going to fall in love the way I've written her in in that in the second book, which is going to be the first book. The reader is not going to fall in love with her because they're only going to see her in pain. I mean,
Mm.
there's only so much pain readers can take. They need to, I mean, maybe, I don't know. There's a
Well,
straight argument.
so here's the thing about readers. Readers want to show up for an emotional experience. What emotion you put on the page depends on the emotional experience you want to craft, right? We've all had a time in our lives where we want to read a story where someone is experiencing pain because it's reflective of something in our own lives that maybe we can't get a hold of, right? And if we can experience pain through empathy, it can sometimes help us process our own pain. In the same way that sometimes when we're in a painful spot in our lives, we only want to experience stories of joy because we're not able to express that in our own way. Sometimes, if we feel like we're in a humdrum point of our lives where everything feels the same, a lot of homeostasis. Maybe we want to read a book like Reacher or an adventure story or a fantasy sci-fi because it makes us feel adventurous because we're not getting that in our own lives. Maybe we are adventuring on something new and exciting in our own life, but we're not really sure how to navigate the change. So we're going to read an adventure story because it's going to give us the courage to do the thing in our own lives, right? And most people aren't able to articulate, oh, I want to read a really sad story right now because I need to have an emotional outlet, right? Like most people don't have, some people do, right? Like some people are super self-aware and they know that like I want to process a feeling and I'm going to do it through someone else's story. I would say the average reader, though, picks up a story because somebody else says, hey, this is great. You're going to love it. Right. And then they just go along for the journey, but they fall in love with the characters. They fall in love with the emotional experience. So I would say, from the standpoint of the story itself, starting a character in a very low point in their lives can be just as compelling for a reader as starting somebody in a very high point in their lives. It's just about the story you want to craft. Let me ask you a couple of questions about what you're thinking, because you've mentioned now that you've got two books, one comes before, one comes after, and then now you're talking about maybe even going back further in the story.
No, these are just thoughts. They're
Sure.
all thoughts.
Well, and that's the good thing about writers, right? Is you all always have another story to be able to tell. We editors don't know how you come up with those, but we are happy to sit and listen to all of the ideas. So, um, typically, can you still hear me? Sometimes I
Yes.
accidentally turn
No, I
my
can hear you.
microphone off.
I can hear you.
Okay. Will you say something, please?
Yes. Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
now I can't hear you. Hold on.
Okay.
We had this problem. I thought we fixed this before. Oh, there we go. Hold on.
Can Want me to
There.
talk?
Yes, there
Yeah.
we go.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Sorry about that.
No, no, no.
I'm the worst podcaster ever. Like I don't know how to use my equipment. Anyway, so as you're thinking about your story, um, there are a couple of ways that you can conceptualize your story and the order that you want to release it. Stories happen chronologically, right? She's a child, she grows up, she goes to the FBI academy, she gets married, she has children, she's doing this wonderful job, she experiences all this loss, and then she has to navigate her life in a world that has, presumably, if she was at the FBI Academy,
Of
presumably
course.
there's like, oh, killers,
Killers.
right? Okay.
Killers.
I was going to say villains, but all right,
No.
villains are killers, right? Um, the FBI takes care of a lot of stuff, bank robberies and such. Okay, so she's dealing with killers, catching killers, not dealing with them, catching them, and navigating this loss, right? You can tell, and then presumably at some point she starts processing through her pain, and maybe there's an opportunity for her to get some resolution. She's always going to feel the hurt, she's always going to feel the loss, but maybe there's something more for her beyond just catching killers or in addition to catching killers, right? Like this story happens chronologically. As an author, you do not have to release that story in chronological order. What I heard you say is that her voice is much clearer to you in what happens chronologically in the second book. If that's the case, my recommendation to you is to focus on that second book. Get the voice, get the place where you know her the best, and then you can go back and you can work on the first book and you can end the first book at the beginning of where the second book starts. It doesn't have to necessarily be released in that order. You could release it as book two first, and then book one is her origin story. People love a good origin story. Doesn't have to go that way. You can write them both and release them both. But my question for you then is, do you think that this is going to be two books, or do you think there's going to be more after book two?
If I write this, if I
Hmm.
write it, I can see this going just like Kurt's and Child's.
Excellent.
If I can get it, all is going to depend on the character voice.
Hmm.
If I can get her the way I want her, as distinct, as appealing to, so that readers can identify with her,
hmm
because she's going to embody, as Reacher and as Smoke does, all human, whatever any human goes through, depending on what's hitting
hmm
them. But they have a base. She does have a baseline of her ethical, just like Reacher and just like Smoke. There, other people may not think they're ethical, but they have their ethical baseline. So
hmm
as wild as hers may be, or theirs, it's still there.
Yeah. So when you're talking about a character that is very grounded in their own moral compass like that, um, it's not, I mean, obviously, we're all going to be judging because that's what we do as people, right? We're going to think about it, and if I were there, would I have done, right? And that's, and that in and of itself is a very compelling story that people are going to want to connect with. The one thing that I would caution you toward is conflating moral compass and character voice. And here's what I mean by that.
Okay.
Moral compass is going to be something that drives decisions. Voice is going to be more an expression of themselves. So if somebody has a very strong moral compass, their character voice may be very decisive, right? They know in an instant what's right and wrong to them
For them.
or for them, right? Like they're not projecting it necessarily to anyone else. They might not even be trying to influence anyone else. So that moral compass can be a contributing factor to voice, but it shouldn't be the driving force. So, for example, Reacher, and I haven't read the stories, but I have watched the series. And I read a book, I read a series that has a similar to Reacher character. And again, I find the character very compelling because of that moral compass, right? Like you're faced with hard situations, impossible situations, lots of times. You have a split second to make a decision between life and death for multiple people involved. And yet somehow you make it based off of, right? Like it's a very compelling. And that compass creates a sense of confidence in the person.
No regret.
No regret, right? Like I have to make this decision, I have to commit to it, I have to move on. So it's a contributing factor to the voice, the way they speak, but it's the decisions that are the outcome of it really become like a driving force in your story.
Okay, so it can't be seen as a distinct characteristic of the character.
It can be, but it's more of a background characteristic. It's not necessarily voice. And the reason that I want to make this distinction here is because voice is made up of several different things, right? It's cadence, it's pacing, it's word choice, it's body
Body
language.
language, right?
And those factors are influenced by our experiences, where we live, where we grow up, what kind of education we have, who we spend our time with, what our job is. All of those things are contributing factors to our voice. But you wouldn't necessarily say that a college professor, their voice is that they are a college professor, right?
No,
Their
correct.
voice
Mhm.
might be very commanding, it might be very educated, it might be very decisive, but you wouldn't say college voice, or excuse me, college professor is their voice, it's their profession, right? And that's the same thing that you want to do in making the distinction. And here's the other thing. You were mentioning about character voice and finding the baseline. Your character's baseline voice is going to shift from book to book based off of the experiences. But the fact that she has a moral compass that is ever true is not going to change. That's going to carry on from book to book to book. She's going to make the same decisions on an almost every situation through every book of your series, whether you have one book or 12 books. That moral compass is going to be her true north. But her baseline voice might change depending on the circumstances. The She might have, assuming you have lots and lots of books, she may have a case in book 4 or book 5 of your series that reminds her very much of the child that she lost and the husband that she lost. Her baseline voice is going to be a little shakier in that book because everything is so raw to her, right? In a in a case where she knows like the pain that the killer is causing, and she's like, it's all about the motivation, all about the villain and her head to head throughout the whole book. Her baseline voice might be much stronger and much more confident than in another story where maybe there are multiple suspects in the case where there's a lot more deliberation in her baseline voice. So her voice is going to adjust and modulate. All of our voices adjust and modulate. But when you're talking about a character who has such a true compass, moral compass, you want that compass to be the underlying decision maker in your stories. Does that distinction help a little bit?
Mhm. Yeah, I'm just thinking because of all the pain she goes through, and in the second one I write that is going to be the first one, she throws, it's like her moral compass disintegrates. Um, but then she finds, I mean, just totally the antithesis of she goes nuts. She goes wild. Um, there are lots of stuff going on. But then she finds it again
Mhm.
as soon as the second book. And
Mm.
then from there on, I don't know if that's okay, but that's what kind of happens, you know?
Absolutely. And people who have a very strong moral compass, at some point in their lives, that compass is tested, right? That's why we have compasses, right? To help us find our way. Just because we have a compass doesn't mean we're going to use it. There are lots of times where we know the right thing to do and we choose to do the easy thing or the thing that makes us feel good or the things that we're being pressured to do. It absolutely makes sense to have that shift happen. And that's actually a really fantastic plot arc for a story. People love um, a I am lost and I find myself story, right? Like it
And
works.
I think what I if I continue to write or publish what I've written, she goes through. And I think every woman, and I guess a man could also identify, you know, deciding to leave their moral compass when they've been that hurt, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Why should I stay true
right,
to everything when I'm just going to feel loss after loss after loss?
right,
Absolutely.
right.
We all think that in that situation, maybe we wouldn't, but we can always empathize with the person when it happens, right? Like,
I'm
how
not
could
so
you
sure.
not? Right.
Don't
And
never say never.
And I think that's the thing, going back to your original question about, is there room in the thriller genre for some lit fic themes? Or is there room in lit fic for some thriller themes? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think there's enough room in literature for every story and every voice. And this is what I meant in the beginning when I said that I think that genre is based off of selling books and connecting people to stories that are like, right? Like as humans, we're used to grouping things. All the blue things go together, all the red things go together, right? Like we're just used to sorting. It's how our minds work. And you have a history in counseling, you know how the brain works, how like we take in new information and the first thing we do is compare it to something else we have. So genre makes sense, but I think as an author, we should use genre as a way to help us clarify the stories that we want to tell when we're getting to a place where it feels muddy and murky and we're not really sure what to do. Look to what's in the field to see how other authors are resolving those kind of messy things. But I don't think that we need to write a story that looks exactly like someone else's story. You mentioned that your character, Christine, it has some of the same components as Smoke and as Reacher, but she doesn't have the same voice. That's great. She shouldn't have the same voice. She
Right.
should have Christine's
Her
voice.
own voice.
Right.
Right.
And yes, we may want to read and be like, oh yeah, this is reminiscent of Reacher, so that when we finish all of the Reacher stories and all the Smoke stories and we need something else to read, we can go grab a Christine book and keep our rotation going. I think that's wonderful. And I love that you're using the stories that you connect to as the inspiration for your own writing, because I think sometimes when we try so hard to fit into one element, we sometimes lose the joy of the story itself, right? And not that your story is joyful, but there is a love that has to go into art, writing being one of those, right? Like you have to enjoy the process of writing. And if you're finding that at every step you have to backtrack because you're not fitting exactly into the mold, then I think it can be really frustrating and it can be really overwhelming. So, really leaning into the story you have to tell with the character, because you clearly know this character inside and out from her childhood through her adulthood, you can use that in your story writing.
That's very helpful. And
Excellent.
I think the whole issue of, do you use background, do you integrate the background within the story? And I think that's, instead of doing like a book before, um, because there would, although I think it would be somewhat interesting, it would not be as interesting as what's going to happen to her.
Hmm.
So what you said about character voice, um, her baseline in each book, you're right, is going to adapt to the situation and then modulate from there.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And that can be kind of a hard concept to grasp onto when you're thinking about writing a series, especially because when we're looking at a series like Reacher, it feels like Reacher's voice never changes. And Reacher's voice modulates less than a typical POV character, because the people around him are modulating for him. He
Right.
actually, becomes like the touchstone for everyone else. Um, Reacher is compelling in combination of that strength and the situations that he's facing
And the people around him.
and the people
Exactly. It's
around
what I'm
him.
going to need her around her. Yeah. Hmm.
Except that your character, the way that you're describing her, has a more tangible feel to her, giving her more space to modulate, even if it's not great waves of modulation. And let me just go back and repeat what I heard you say about how you want to build her as a character, just to make sure that I'm giving you the advice that's best for your story.
I
So,
appreciate that.
what I heard you say is that you want her to be navigating a world through a veil of pain, right? She's suffered this great loss and it has changed her entire perspective on her life. But you also said you don't want her to lose her compassion for other people. You
Absolutely.
want her to be more feminine in her connection. And the way I'm interpreting that, and I'm not sure if this is what you meant, but I'm interpreting it more of that like mothering, that coming in and caring a little bit more. Is that
A,
is
a
that
little,
close or?
a little bit more. She's going to be a force to deal with,
Hmm.
but she's not going to be. a hard, she's, I want I want her to maintain her femininity, um, the way she sees people, but she'll be similar in the respect that for herself, she's not going to grant herself, at this point anyway, the opportunity to connect with someone else,
Perfect. Okay.
Um,
So I think of that scene in Reacher, and again, I apologize. This is a TV reference, not a book, not necessarily a book reference. At the start of season two, Reacher's at the ATM, and
right.
the woman in front of him is terrified. She knows that he knows that she's being carjacked. He goes, sorry for the spoiler, anybody who hasn't seen it. He goes to the car and he beats the living daylights out of this perp, drops him in the middle of the street, like looks at the kid in the background, walks away, tells the woman, call 911, and then just goes about his day. Right. We love that about Reacher because he does the right thing, but he doesn't actually get involved. I see Christine at the like in a similar situation. She's at the ATM, she sees the woman, but instead of just walking away, she says to the woman, it's okay, I'm here for you. Like gives her a moment of like
Yeah, she doesn't.
expectation of help.
Right. She doesn't beat the guy up, but her gift is she's a profiler. She's so it's her mind, it's her emotion, it's her psychology. It's her,
Hmm.
yeah. Hmm.
Okay. So, but in that moment, instead of just walking away from this poor woman at the
No, she won't
ATM,
walk away.
right?
No.
She's gonna offer guidance and comfort and
Oh,
connection.
she's going to take the woman by the hand and take her away from him.
Right. Okay. So and that moment of connection with other people is what's going to make Christine compelling because readers want to see themselves in that situation taking care of business. Reacher takes care of business by beating everybody up,
Right.
leaving a mess for everyone else to deal with. Emotional fallout be damned, pardon the phrase, like the emotional component of this is somebody else's problem. He gets in, he gets his hands dirty, so nobody else has to. Christine, I see the way you're describing her, she's there for the emotional part of the journey. She's there to help people with the start of processing what's happening. That is a really compelling character that gives you a lot of place to grow, but because of that, her voice is going to modulate more than Reacher's voice modulates. Reacher's voice doesn't have to modulate because he doesn't talk to anybody, right? He
Beats him up.
grunts, he nods, he talks with his fists, he punches people. His love language is how many times am I
Yeah.
going to shoot somebody, right? Like if I
Yeah.
don't care about you, I'm going to shoot you one time. If you're really annoying me, I'm going to shoot you five times. If
Right.
I'm just having a bad day, all bets are off. I'm going to unload my entire magazine into you, right? Like,
And Evan Smoke is he uses jujitsu and karate and all that stuff. Yeah.
yep, excellent. So the way that you're describing Christine, she is going to be much more communicative. She's going to use her ability to look at a situation and empathize with the
Diffuse it.
people. And yeah, exactly.
And she's also, the reason she gets in trouble a lot is she's also there for the killer. Because she's a profiler, it's
Hmm.
not just to catch him, it's to understand him, save him from himself. So there's a
Right,
lot of conflict. That's what gets her in trouble all the
right,
time. Yeah,
right.
bureaucrat.
Well, and the way that you talk about that, um, going back to genre, right? The reason that we love a Criminal Minds or a thriller story is because of this idea that there's like one trigger between somebody being an FBI profiler and somebody being a serial killer, right? Like it's one thing goes in a different direction and somebody takes a different path. So in order to catch a killer, oftentimes the detectives, the profilers, the agents, whomever they are, have to empathize with the villain in the story. And that vulnerability, that connection that they make, like you say, it creates that sense of I'm always on the line. You know, am I going to step over? Am I going to end up being the monster that I'm trying to hunt?
Right.
And again, very, very compelling inside of the thriller mystery genres, that connection, that crossover, but it also lends itself very well to this idea of lit fic, which is, and you can write a theme of losing yourself in your work, right? Like,
Absolutely.
you know,
And finding yourself again. She's going to
right,
lose herself a couple times,
right.
and then find herself. Yeah,
Yep, yep.
just like human beings do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When we're faced with a new situation, we have to learn how to navigate. We have to adapt. We can't all just stay in exactly the same place.
See, that's the only reason I'm writing. I want to help the reader. I
Hmm.
want to help the, I want them to be able to identify, and after they go through everything, say, you know what? I didn't do such a damn bad job. I did
Right.
pretty darn well,
Right, right. This idea that that circumstances impact the decisions that we make, where no one's making decisions in a vacuum, and that there's room for forgiveness and there's room for grace and there's room for understanding. It doesn't always have to be black and white in things. There can be nuance and shades of gray and understanding. But in order to do that, we have to be able to see through someone else's perspective. And it really sounds like the character that you're creating in Christine is going to give the readers that insight, not just into Christine, but into the people that she is coming in contact with.
If I can write it that way. Yeah, it's in my head.
Well, and that's where stories start, right?
Yeah.
Like they have to start somewhere, and you have a very clear vision of what you want for this story, whether it becomes a two book. I don't know, somebody who knows more about um, the author, like publishing world, will have to tell us, do two books a series constitute, or do you need three book? I mean, three books is a trilogy, whatever. But you've got it in you. Um, let yourself enjoy that. I would say though, as you're thinking about what book goes where, you keep talking about the second book being the first book and the first book being the second book. Again, for right now, like if that helps you from a chronological standpoint, think about it from a chronological standpoint. But I don't necessarily think that that's the way that you have to roll the series out, especially if you think your readers are going to connect better in what happens chronologically second. If you think that she's inherently more likable, you may want to release that book first. You don't have to, but sometimes it's easier for people to connect with and then go backward. And maybe it's you write chronologically book two and book three before you release the origin story in book one, so that we get to know who Christine is a little bit before we go back to understand how she got there. Serial authors often do that, where they'll start with what's the most compelling part of the story right forward, and then all of a sudden we have to go backward to see what happened before. And that can work really well because readers love to wonder what happened before, even if they don't know. And then all of a sudden you give them what happened before, and it's like, oh, this is better than what I imagined. So
Yeah, that's all been very helpful.
excellent, excellent. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and turn the recording off.
Thank you. Mhm.
And if I remember how,